Sarah Washington's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she checked her phone one more time. The text from her sister flashed on the screen. "Dad's not breathing right. They're taking him to Metro General. Hurry." The morning rain hammered against her windshield, each droplet echoing her racing heartbeat. She had already missed 2 calls from the hospital while in her morning editorial meeting. The thought of her father, the invincible civil rights attorney Calvin Washington, lying vulnerable in a hospital bed, made her press the accelerator harder. The digital clock on her dashboard read 9:47 a.m. Morning traffic was still heavy on Madison Avenue. Through the blur of windshield wipers, Sarah spotted the traffic light turning yellow at the intersection ahead. Her publisher's voice echoed in her mind from just 30 minutes ago. "We need those manuscript revisions by noon, Sarah. The board is waiting." But right now, none of that mattered. Not the manuscripts, not the deadline, not the promotion she'd been eyeing. Her father's voice, usually so strong and clear during their Sunday dinners, had been unusually weak when she'd called him yesterday. The light turned red. Sarah was half a block away, the intersection almost empty. In that split second, she made her calculation. Stopping meant another 3 minutes, maybe 4. 4 minutes her father might not have. She pressed down on the gas. The flash came just as her car crossed the line. Sarah knew immediately what it meant. The red light camera had caught her. But she couldn't focus on that now. 3 minutes later, she sprinted through the sliding doors of Metro General's emergency room, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floors, her rain-soaked blazer clinging to her shoulders. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in courtroom 4B, her medical documentation neatly organized in a folder. She'd spent hours preparing her explanation, the same methodical approach she used when editing best-selling manuscripts at Riverside Publishing. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with worn wooden benches and flickering fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly sickly tinge. Judge Michael Bennett adjusted his reading glasses as he looked down at her case file. Sarah studied him, mid-50s, silver hair perfectly combed, the kind of distinguished look that usually graced legal drama book covers. Her trained editor's eye noticed his subtle tell, the slight tightening of his jaw when he read her name, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. "Ms. Washington," he began, his tone carrying that particular weight she'd grown familiar with over years of professional spaces. "You're here for running a red light on Madison Avenue on the morning of October 12th. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and steady, just as her father had taught her. "I accept that I ran the red light, but I request the court's consideration of the extraordinary circumstances." She reached for her folder. "I have here documentation from Metro General Hospital showing my father was admitted that morning with symptoms of cardiac arrest. I also have—" "Ms. Washington," Judge Bennett interrupted, barely glancing at the documents she held out. "The law is quite clear about traffic violations. They exist to protect public safety. Your personal emergency, while unfortunate, does not excuse putting others at risk." Sarah felt her professional mask slip slightly. "Your Honor, if you would just look at the camera footage clearly shows your vehicle entering the intersection 3 seconds after the light turned red." He continued as if she hadn't spoken. "This is a serious violation." The moment stretched between them. Sarah saw something in his eyes she recognized from countless meetings and interviews, that subtle glaze of someone who had already made their decision before he'd finished speaking. "Maximum fine of $500, Judge Bennett declared, his gavel punctuating the air. "Next case." Sarah stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the unused medical documents heavy in her hands. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of Judge Bennett already focused on the next case file, her presence forgotten. The familiar sensation of being unseen, unheard, and prejudged burned in her throat. What Judge Bennett couldn't know, as he dismissed her so easily, was that their paths would cross again, in a place where the power dynamic wouldn't be so firmly in his favor. Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked out of the courtroom, her mind already turning to the writers' group meeting she would be attending that evening as their newest member. Judge Michael Bennett loosened his bow tie as the elevator ascended to the penthouse floor of the Wellington, one of the city's most prestigious residential buildings. His weathered leather briefcase held not case files or legal documents, but something far more precious, the manuscript he'd been laboring over for 2 years, printed on cream-colored paper that cost more than he cared to admit. The elevator doors opened to reveal a sprawling penthouse, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. This was Bennett's sanctuary, far removed from the stark fluorescent lighting and wooden benches of his courtroom. Here, every Thursday evening, 12 of the city's most promising writers gathered to share their literary aspirations. Michael, Charlotte Reynolds, the group's coordinator and a successful mystery novelist, greeted him with her usual enthusiasm. "You're just in time. We have exciting news tonight." Bennett smiled, carefully placing his manuscript on the mahogany coffee table. None of his colleagues at the courthouse knew about his secret passion, a historical novel set during the civil rights movement. They wouldn't understand how a judge who spent his days delivering verdicts could spend his nights crafting prose about justice and redemption. The other members filtered in, taking their usual seats. James, the poetry professor; Maria, the young journalist; Thomas, the retired English teacher. The room hummed with the comfortable energy of people united by their love of words. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm cookies from Charlotte's personal chef filled the air. "Before we begin," Charlotte announced, commanding attention with her publisher's presence, "I have someone special to introduce. We're incredibly fortunate to have a new member joining us." She gestured toward the entrance. Sarah Washington, senior editor at Riverside Publishing. Her recent anthology, Voices Unheard, just made the New York Times bestseller list. Bennett's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah Washington walked in, wearing an elegantly tailored burgundy blazer that was a far cry from the rain-soaked outfit she'd worn in his courtroom. Her stride was confident, her smile warm as she greeted the group, but he noticed the slight hesitation when their eyes met. "Sarah brings over a decade of editorial experience," Charlotte continued, oblivious to the tension crackling between her newest and oldest members. "Her insights will be invaluable to our group." Bennett watched, paralyzed, as Sarah took the empty seat directly across from him, the manuscript in front of him. His proud creation about a white lawyer defending a black activist in 1963 Birmingham suddenly felt pathetically ironic. "Thank you for having me." Sarah's voice carried the same clear authority it had in his courtroom, but here it commanded a different kind of respect. "I've heard wonderful things about this group's commitment to authentic storytelling." The emphasis on authentic wasn't lost on Bennett. He noticed how the other members leaned forward when she spoke, already drawn to her presence. Thomas immediately engaged her in a discussion about her anthology, and her responses revealed a depth of literary knowledge that made Bennett sink further into his leather armchair. Sarah's anthology challenged conventional narratives about civil rights history, Charlotte explained to the group. It brought forward voices that had been systematically silenced. Bennett's throat went dry. His manuscript's central character, a white lawyer having a moral awakening about racial injustice, now seemed embarrassingly tone-deaf. He thought about how easily he'd dismissed Sarah's explanation in court, how he hadn't even bothered to look at her documentation. As the meeting began and other members shared their work, Bennett observed Sarah. She offered brilliant insights on character development, plot structure, and thematic resonance. Her critiques were incisive but kind, technical yet accessible. Each comment demonstrated why she'd risen to such prominence in the publishing world. The leather folder containing his manuscript felt heavy in his lap as the sharing circle moved closer to his turn. Sarah pulled out a sleek notebook, her pen poised to take notes. In that moment, Judge Michael Bennett, who had presided over hundreds of cases with unwavering confidence, felt the unfamiliar weight of being judged himself. What terrified him most wasn't just the reversal of power. It was the realization that her judgment, unlike his, would be based on a genuine evaluation of his work, his thoughts, his understanding of the very issues he claimed to care about in his writing. The first hour of critique proceeded with excruciating precision as Sarah Washington systematically transformed the writer's group dynamic. Each word she spoke carried the weight of someone who had shepherded dozens of books to bestseller status, who could spot lazy writing and half-formed ideas from 50 paces. In this scene, she said, addressing Maria's political thriller, "You're telling us about tension instead of letting us feel it." Her fingers traced the lines on the page. "Show us the sweat on the diplomat's collar, the way his hands shake as he opens the classified file. Make us hear the ceiling fan's uneven rhythm that matches his heartbeat." Bennett watched the group's reaction. Maria, who typically defended her work fiercely, was scribbling notes with unprecedented enthusiasm. Even James, the poetry professor who usually offered only cryptic feedback, leaned forward in his chair, captivated. "The strength of your premise," Sarah continued, "lies in its exploration of power dynamics. But power isn't just in dramatic confrontations, it's in subtle gestures, in what remains unsaid." She paused, her eyes briefly meeting Bennett's. Sometimes the most profound abuse of power happens in mundane moments, in quick judgments made without full consideration. The air in the room felt heavier. Bennett loosened his collar, hyper-aware of how his own manuscript sat untouched beside him. His protagonist, a white lawyer named Harrison Pierce, suddenly seemed like a cardboard cutout compared to the complex characters Sarah was describing. When Thomas shared his memoir about teaching in rural America, Sarah's critique was equally transformative. "You're writing about privilege and education," she said, "but you're maintaining a safe distance from the uncomfortable truths. Dive deeper. Show us the moments that made you question your own assumptions." Charlotte, who had run the group for 5 years, watched with poorly concealed amazement as Sarah demolished and rebuilt their understanding of storytelling. The usual workshop platitudes about finding your voice and writing what you know were replaced by incisive questions about perspective, responsibility, and the weight of unexamined biases. "Literature isn't just about telling stories," Sarah explained, responding to a question about her anthology's success. "It's about challenging the narratives we've accepted without question. Every sentence is an opportunity to either reinforce or interrogate our assumptions." The copper pendant lights overhead cast a warm glow on the group, but Bennett felt exposed, as if sitting under his courtroom's harsh fluorescence. He thought about how many times he delivered verdicts without questioning his own assumptions, how many lives he'd impacted with the same casual certainty he used to mark up manuscript pages. During the coffee break, Bennett overheard Sarah discussing publishing trends with Charlotte. "The industry is finally realizing that authenticity can't be faked," she said. "Readers can tell when an author is writing from a place of genuine understanding versus theoretical knowledge." The words hit Bennett like a physical blow. His novel, with its white savior narrative, dressed up in historical fiction clothing, was exactly what Sarah was critiquing. Theory without understanding, observation without insight. As the break ended, Sarah pulled out a sleek tablet. "I hope you don't mind," she said to the group, "but I've made some notes on current publishing requirements for historical fiction, particularly regarding civil rights narratives." Her eyes swept the room, lingering meaningfully on Bennett's manuscript. "The standards have evolved significantly in recent years." The group gathered closer, eager for insider knowledge. Bennett watched as Sarah commanded the room with the same quiet authority he wielded in his courtroom. But where his power came from his position, hers came from expertise, insight, and a deep understanding of human nature. "The key," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the penthouse, "is recognizing the difference between writing about injustice and understanding it, between observing and experiencing, between judgment and justice." Bennett felt each word land like a verdict. In his courtroom, he controlled the narrative. Here, Sarah was rewriting the rules of engagement, challenging not just their writing, but their way of seeing the world. As his turn to share approached, he realized that for the first time in years, He was about to be judged by someone who could see through every layer of his carefully constructed narrative, both on and off the page. "And now," Charlotte announced, "we'll hear from Michael." She smiled encouragingly at Bennett, unaware of the tension that had been building throughout the evening. "He's been working on a powerful piece about the civil rights movement." The leather folder felt impossibly heavy as Bennett opened it with fingers that had sentenced thousands, but now trembled slightly. The cream-colored pages, once a source of pride, seemed to mock him with their expensive weight. Harrison Pierce, he began, his judicial voice deserting him, stood before the courthouse steps in Birmingham, watching the protesters gather. The words felt hollow now, each sentence a testament to his own limited perspective. He had prosecuted civil rights cases for years, but something about this morning was different. Sarah's pen remained motionless on her notepad. Her stillness was more unnerving than any note-taking could have been. Bennett forced himself to continue, describing how his protagonist had an awakening after witnessing police brutality against peaceful protesters. The officer's baton caught the young man across the shoulders, Bennett read, and in that moment, Harrison realized justice wore different faces depending on who was watching. He paused, the irony of his own words hitting him with unexpected force. When he finished reading the chapter, the usual supportive murmurs from the group were notably absent. The penthouse's panoramic windows reflected the group's images like a mirror, forcing Bennett to see himself as others did. A judge reading about justice to the very person he had judged unfairly. Sarah set down her pen with deliberate care. "You write with technical skill," she began, her voice measured. "Your sentences are well crafted. Your pacing is solid." The pause that followed felt eternal. "But your protagonist's struggle feels theoretical, Judge Bennett, like someone observing injustice through bulletproof glass rather than experiencing it." The use of his title, Judge Bennett, hung in the air like an indictment. "Your character," she continued, "has what I call convenient empathy. He witnesses one incident of brutality and suddenly understands systemic racism. But transformation isn't a moment. It's a painful process of confronting one's own complicity in the systems we claim to oppose." Charlotte shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing the undercurrent but unable to place its source. The other members watched in fascination as Sarah systematically dismantled not just Bennett's writing, but the assumptions underlying it. "Harrison Pierce," Sarah said, picking up a page, "believes that recognizing injustice is the same as understanding it. He thinks that because he can see the problem, he's part of the solution." Her eyes met Bennett's. "But real change requires more than observation. It demands self-examination, uncomfortable truths, and the humility to acknowledge our own biases." Bennett thought of Sarah standing in his courtroom, documents in hand, trying to explain about her father. He hadn't even looked at her evidence, confident in his own judgment, just like Harrison Pierce was confident in his understanding of justice. The scene where Harrison convinces the other prosecutors to drop charges, Sarah noted, feels particularly problematic. "You've written it as a white savior narrative, where the black protesters need Harrison's enlightenment to achieve justice. Their own decades of struggle become merely a backdrop for his moral evolution." The other writers were scribbling furiously now, but Bennett knew they weren't just taking notes about writing technique. Sarah was teaching them about power, perspective, and the responsibility of storytelling. "If you want this novel to resonate," she said, softening her tone slightly, "you need to ask yourself harder questions. Why did Harrison never notice injustice before this moment? What made him complicit in the system he now questions? What privileges allowed him to remain blind for so long?" Each question felt like a gavel strike. Bennett saw his novel for what it was, not the profound exploration of justice he'd imagined, but a reflection of his own unexamined biases. "The truth is," Sarah concluded, gathering her notes, "you're writing about awakening to injustice, while demonstrating exactly how people in power can remain blind to it. Perhaps that's the real story here, not Harrison's convenient epiphany, but the system that allowed him to ignore reality for so long." The silence that followed was complete. Through the windows, city lights twinkled like distant witnesses to this quiet demolition of a judge's carefully constructed narrative. Bennett realized that in trying to write about justice, he had instead revealed its absence, both on the page and in his own courtroom. The Wellington's underground parking garage was eerily quiet at 10:30 p.m., the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars. Bennett walked toward his car, his manuscript no longer pristine but crumpled slightly at the edges from his tight grip. The sound of heels clicking on concrete behind him made him stop. "Judge Bennett," Sarah's voice echoed off the walls. "I believe we have unfinished business." He turned to face her, noticing how the garage lighting created the same institutional atmosphere as his courtroom. But here, the power dynamic was reversed. "Ms. Washington, your critique was illuminating." "Was it?" She moved closer, her burgundy blazer now appearing almost black in the shadowed light. "Because I wonder if you truly understand the connection between Harrison Pierce's convenient awakening and your own judicial conduct." Bennett felt his defense mechanisms rising. "My novel is fiction. My courtroom is reality." "Is it?" Sarah's laugh was sharp, cutting through the garage's stale air. "Because 2 weeks ago, you demonstrated exactly how fiction and reality intersect. You did to me what Harrison does to his black characters. Turn me into a prop in your narrative of justice." "I followed the law," Bennett said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "The law." Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly. "Let me tell you about the law. While you were up there pronouncing maximum fines, my father, retired civil rights attorney Calvin Washington, was having a heart attack." She held up the phone, showing him a hospital photo. "The same father who spent 30 years fighting for equal justice in the same courts where you now preside." Bennett's throat tightened. Calvin Washington was a legend in legal circles. His cases had set precedents that Bennett had studied in law school. "I had all the documentation," Sarah continued, her voice steady but intense. "Hospital records, emergency calls, everything. But you couldn't even spare 30 seconds to look at them. You were too busy being Harrison Pierce, convinced of your own righteousness." Bennett started, but Sarah held up her hand. "Here's what's fascinating, Judge Bennett. In your novel, Harrison has his great epiphany watching a protest. But in real life, you sat in your writers' group for 2 years, crafting a story about justice, while dealing out injustice with the casual confidence of someone who's never had to question their own authority." The garage ventilation system hummed overhead, a mechanical Greek chorus to their confrontation. Bennett leaned against a concrete pillar, suddenly needing the support. "You want to know why your novel rings false?" Sarah's voice softened slightly. "Because you're writing about awakening to injustice while actively perpetuating it. You're trying to create Harrison's revelation without having your own." "Your father," Bennett said quietly. "Did he?" "He survived." Sarah's face showed the first crack in her professional veneer. "No thanks to the delay at that red light. But that's not really the point, is it?" Bennett thought about his own father, a victim of a drunk driver who ran a red light 20 years ago. "That's why I'm so strict with traffic violations," he admitted. "My father died because someone broke the law." Sarah finished. "I'm sorry for your loss. Truly. But you're letting your pain blind you to others' emergencies. You're doing exactly what Harrison does, seeing everything through the lens of your own experience while ignoring everyone else's reality." The truth of her words hit him with physical force. His novel, his judgments, his entire approach to justice, all of it filtered through his privileged perspective. "Your critique," he said slowly, "wasn't just about my writing, was it?" "Nothing is just about one thing, Judge Bennett. That's what I've been trying to tell you." Sarah adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "Your novel needs work, but more importantly, so does your understanding of justice. Real justice, not the kind that makes the person in power feel righteous." She turned to leave, then paused. "You know what the real irony is? In your novel, Harrison Pierce learns his lesson. I wonder if his creator can do the same." The sound of her heels faded away, leaving Bennett alone in the garage, holding a manuscript that now felt like evidence of his own prejudice. Above him, the fluorescent lights flickered, a stark reminder that sometimes illumination comes in harsh and uncomfortable ways. Long after the courthouse had emptied, Bennett sat in his chambers, surrounded by towering stacks of case files. His computer screen glowed with an Excel spreadsheet, a meticulous record of every traffic violation case he'd presided over in the past year. The data painted a disturbing picture he could no longer ignore. Average fine for white defendants, $175. He muttered, scrolling through his analysis. Average fine for defendants of color, $342. His stomach churned as he created another pivot table, this time sorting by neighborhood demographics. The antique clock on his wall, a gift from his father upon passing the bar exam, ticked accusingly in the silence. Bennett pulled up another case, a white college student who'd run a red light while rushing his drunk friend to the hospital. He'd accepted the emergency explanation without requiring documentation. Fine, $100. His door creaked open, and Janet, his clerk of 15 years, poked her head in. Judge Bennett, it's nearly 9 p.m. Are you? She trailed off, taking in the chaos of papers surrounding him. Janet, he said, not looking up, can you pull all my traffic violation cases from the past 3 years? And I need the demographic data for each district. She hesitated. Sir, is this about that manuscript you're working on? Bennett finally looked up, noticed the concern in her eyes. No, Janet. This is about something far more important. He gestured to his screen. Did you know I've been giving higher fines to minority defendants? Not by a small margin, by nearly double in some cases. Janet shifted uncomfortably. Judge, everyone knows you're tough, but fair. Fair. The word tasted bitter now. Tell me, Janet, what's fair about dismissing Ms. Washington's hospital documentation 2 weeks ago, when 3 months earlier I accepted Mr. Anderson's verbal explanation for the exact same violation? The next morning, Bennett sat in on Judge Rodriguez's traffic court. He watched his colleague review each case with methodical care, asking questions, examining evidence. When a young black woman presented hospital documentation for an emergency, Rodriguez took time to read it thoroughly before reducing her fine. During lunch, Bennett overheard 2 other judges in the break room. These people always have excuses, Judge Harrison was saying. If we listen to every sob story, like you listened to that surgeon last week. Judge Peters laughed. What was his excuse? Late for golf. Bennett's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He'd laughed at similar comments before, had probably made them himself. Now each word felt like an indictment. That evening, he called his sister, the law professor in Boston. Claire, I need your honest opinion. Have you ever observed bias in my courtroom? The silence on the other end lasted too long. Michael, she finally said, do you remember Jason, my former student who clerked for you last summer? Bright kid, excellent research skills. He wrote a paper about unconscious bias in traffic court. Used your cases as examples. He was too afraid to publish it. Bennett closed his eyes. Another piece of evidence in the growing case against himself. Late that night, he found himself parked outside Metro General Hospital, the same hospital where Sarah's father had been treated, where his own father had died 20 years ago. He watched ambulances arrive, watched people running in with desperate faces, each one carrying a story he might have dismissed from his bench. His phone lit up with a text from Charlotte. Writers grouped tomorrow. Bringing an expert on legal narratives in fiction will help with Harrison's character development. Bennett typed back, need to rewrite more than just Harrison. Then he opened his manuscript file and started deleting. The white savior narrative, the convenient epiphanies, the shallow understanding of justice, all of it had to go. A new document began to take shape on his screen. Not a novel this time, but a formal request to the chief judge for a review of his past decisions. It would likely end his chances for the appellate court position he'd been pursuing. But as he typed, Bennett realized that sometimes the most important judgments are the ones we make about ourselves. The hospital's emergency lights flashed red and blue in his car window, a reminder that justice, like life itself, rarely fits into the neat categories we try to impose upon it. "Delete the entire second chapter," Sarah said, her red pen hovering over Bennett's manuscript. They sat in a quiet corner of the city library, surrounded by law books, neutral territory for both of them. Harrison's white savior complex is strongest here. 3 months had passed since their confrontation in the parking garage. Bennett watched as she methodically dismantled his story, the same way she'd helped him dismantle his preconceptions about justice. "What if," Bennett suggested, leaning forward, "instead of Harrison leading the charge, he witnesses the real activists, the ones who were fighting long before he noticed the problem?" He thought of Calvin Washington, Sarah's father, who had argued civil rights cases while Bennett was still in law school. Sarah looked up, a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Now you're thinking like an editor, and like a real ally." She made another note. "Show the community's strength, not just their suffering. Show how Harrison's awakening is actually him catching up to what others have known for decades." The library's oak tables still bore marks from law students of previous generations. Bennett ran his fingers over the grooves, thinking about cycles of justice and ignorance. "I received the preliminary review of my cases," he said quietly, pulling out a folder. "The bias in my sentencing. It's worse than I thought. The chief judge wants to meet next week." Sarah set down her pen. "Are you ready for the consequences? Like Harrison, I've been hiding behind procedure, behind just following the law." Bennett opened the folder, revealing charts and statistics. "But the data doesn't lie. I've been carrying my father's death like a gavel, using it to strike harder at certain defendants. Awareness without action is just performance," Sarah said, echoing words from their first critique session. She pulled his manuscript closer. "Show that in Harrison. Make his transformation cost him something real." They worked through the afternoon, rebuilding the story from its foundations. Bennett's new version showed Harrison struggling with his complicity, facing opposition from colleagues, losing friends who preferred the comfortable blindness he'd left behind. "Your perspective on the protest scene," Bennett said, pointing to Chapter 5. "It helped me understand something about my father's case." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "The drunk driver who killed him. I've always seen it as just an individual's crime. But there were systemic issues, underfunded addiction programs, lack of late-night public transportation. Understanding the context doesn't excuse the crime," Sarah noted, "but it helps us address the real problems." She turned to a fresh page in her notebook. "That's what your novel needs to show. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding and change." As evening approached, a young law student at a nearby table was visibly struggling with case citations. Bennett overheard her muttering about traffic law precedents, his specialty. Once, he would have stayed silent, focused on his own work. Now he caught Sarah's eye, received her slight nod, and approached the student. "Those cases can be tricky," he said, sitting down, "especially when you're trying to balance public safety with individual circumstances." Later, as they packed up their work, Sarah handed Bennett a business card. "Riverside Publishing is looking for authentic voices in legal fiction, something that challenges the traditional narratives." She smiled slightly. "Your new draft might be interesting to them." "I haven't finished the rewrite," Bennett protested. "You haven't finished your own transformation either," Sarah countered. "That's what makes it real." She shouldered her bag. "By the way, my father's teaching a seminar on civil rights law next month. He'd be interested in hearing about your case review project." Bennett felt the weight of that invitation. "I'd be honored to learn from him." "Good answer," Sarah said, "because he's also interested in your novel. Says it might be useful in his course on systemic bias, as a case study in perspective shifting." As they walked out of the library, they passed the courthouse where Bennett would soon face judgment for his own biased judgments. The setting sun cast long shadows across the steps, reminding him of Harrison Pierce's courthouse epiphany, now rewritten as a moment of humbling rather than heroism. "Same time next week?" Sarah asked, but it wasn't really a question. They both knew that some revisions, both on and off the page, require persistent collaboration. 1 year to the day after Sarah Washington first stood in his courtroom, Judge Michael Bennett sat on the bench, watching a young Latina woman clutch a folder of hospital documents. The scene felt like a mirror image from the past, but this time, everything was different. "Ms. Rodriguez," Bennett said, his voice carrying none of its former automatic authority, "please tell me about the circumstances of your traffic violation." Elena Rodriguez, still wearing scrubs from her hospital shift, straightened her shoulders. "Your Honor, I'm a resident at Metro General. Last night, we had a mass casualty incident, a bus accident. I was called in for emergency surgery, and on my way." She stopped, clearly expecting to be cut off. "Please continue," Bennett encouraged, noticing how she held herself like someone used to being dismissed. Behind her, in the gallery's third row, Sarah sat watching, her presence both witness and reminder. "I ran the red light on Chester Avenue," Elena admitted. "I have the emergency call logs, my badge verification, and the surgery schedule." She began pulling documents from her folder, the same desperate gesture he'd once ignored from Sarah. Bennett studied the evidence carefully, aware of the packed courtroom watching. His recent cases had drawn attention, not all of it positive. Some of his colleagues called him soft. Others, understanding the reason for his changed approach, avoided him in the judge's lounge. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, looking up from the documents, "have you read the recent article in the Law Review about emergency responder traffic violations?" She blinked, surprised. "No, Your Honor." It was written by Calvin Washington. Bennett allowed himself a small smile as he saw Sarah shift forward slightly in her seat. "He argues that our traffic laws need to account for medical personnel responding to emergencies. That justice requires understanding context." The article had been Calvin's response to learning about Sarah's experience in Bennett's courtroom. After months of collaboration on Bennett's case review project, the renowned civil rights attorney had turned his attention to systematic reform of traffic court procedures. "Your documentation is thorough," Bennett continued, "and the law, while designed to protect public safety, must also serve public health." He thought of his father, of Sarah's father, of all the intersections where justice and mercy met. The court finds sufficient cause to reduce the fine to a warning. But more importantly, he turned to address the entire courtroom, knowing his words would be noted. "The court is implementing new guidelines for emergency medical personnel traffic violations. Ms. Rodriguez, you'll receive information about participating in the Policy Development Committee. We need voices like yours in this conversation." Elena's face showed the same shock he'd once seen in defendants who'd expected harsh judgment and found understanding instead. As she gathered her documents, Bennett noticed several other judges had slipped into the back of the courtroom. Word of his transformed approach to justice had spread through the courthouse. After the session, Bennett found Sarah waiting outside his chambers. "Nicely done," she said, falling into step beside him. "Though I notice you quoted my father's article." "I quote him a lot these days," Bennett smiled. "His legal scholarship pairs well with his editorial feedback." They walked toward the parking garage, no longer a place of confrontation, but of transition. "Speaking of feedback," Sarah said, "Riverside wants to move forward with the novel. They think Harrison's journey from judicial arrogance to genuine understanding will resonate, especially given recent discussions about bias in the legal system." Bennett thought about how far both he and his protagonist had come. Harrison's story isn't just about awakening to injustice anymore. It's about the hard work that comes after. That's why it works now. Sarah checked her watch. Writers' group tonight. Charlotte's bringing in a class of law students to discuss the intersection of legal narrative and social justice. Full circle, Bennett mused, remembering that first critique session. Not a circle, Sarah corrected. A spiral. We keep coming back to the same points, but hopefully at a higher level of understanding each time. As they reached their cars, Bennett saw Elena Rodriguez leaving her shift at the hospital across the street. She waved, recognizing them both, the judge who'd heard her story and the editor whose father was helping change the system. "Ready for tonight's critique?" Sarah asked. Bennett watched Elena drive away safely, legally, toward her next emergency. "Ready to keep learning," he replied, knowing it was both an answer and a commitment.